So you're now being caught on camera. Whatever we do is submissible in a court of law, I think. I don't know how it works. Okay, so can I just begin by asking you to introduce yourself, please?
Absolutely, I'd be happy to. So I am Jeanette Washington. I've worked as a speech pathologist, an educator, and a technology professional. I have multiple certifications in different dyslexia and reading programs that help really empower children who are learning to decode and encode. And I have a letters facilitation certificate, which allows me to train educators on a very specific reading program for early education.
Okay, so you said something that I found really interesting there. You're interested in empowering children. Is there any sense that you've found that dyslexic children are disempowered or unempowered?
Yes, I think that's actually a great question. I was reading some research yesterday that entailed how we're so quick to throw all of these reading programs at dyslexic children. However, we fail to really tap into that mental, emotional connection that needs to be made, that self-esteem, that self-regulation, and things like that. So I do think that there is a level of disempowerment. There is a level of self-consciousness that needs to be addressed when we are working with dyslexic children and adults, because they've been taught to believe that the way they learn is not normal and it is disabling. So there is a lot that can be said around that space of, self-esteem and empowerment.
Okay, so a lot of the way that people have been taught to learn, dyslexic kids can be disabling, it can be disempowering, and there can be a lack of self-esteem. Have you seen the results of that?
Absolutely. I've certainly seen children who are really hard on themselves, adults that are very critical of themselves because of the things that they've learned growing up. And again, that comes from people telling them or illustrating to them and depicting that they themselves are not normal, that the way they learn is below average, and that they have issues that will make it hard for them to gain employment or even to move on to the next grade. So I certainly believe that there is a layer around just being able to be confident in one's ability to learn and to really provide and thrive in society.
Yeah, I mean, you come from America. Which state of America are you in at the moment?
So I am currently in the state of Michigan. I've lived in Michigan, I've lived in California, I've lived in Mississippi. So I've seen quite a bit as it relates to legislation around dyslexia and what's going on in school districts and in classrooms all over. So to kind of piggyback or echo a little bit of what you're saying about where I am, there are clearly 50 states and a federal district of the United States. And then we have 5 major territories and various minor islands. Unfortunately, provisions are different in every state and territory, but the overwhelming majority of states have also passed their own laws specifying requirements about dyslexia identification and teacher training. So you will see variances everywhere you go here in the US. For instance, states like Idaho and Hawaii have no provisions in place for school-age children with dyslexia. However, maybe a state like Florida that I've been doing research on has evidence-based and systemic, sequential, and multi-sensory strategies added to their Florida educator practices so that teachers can provide explicit sequential and systematic instruction for their kids.
Okay, and when you say you've been in different states and different areas, have you seen different results then in the way that dyslexia is provided for or understood in these different states? Has that actually filtered down to the end product, if you like, to the children, if I can, be a little bit
So what I would say to that question, Martin, is that when you are in a state that has laws in place to make sure that those children succeed, then you will be in a place where everyone has a higher quality of life. They are embracing all of the neurodiversities that exist, and you will see people really flourishing. When you are in a state where there are little to no provisions, then the education system ultimately fails. It fails the children, it fails the teachers, and you can see a lower quality of life because just when we think about how education just really is the epicenter of the world, and if we are not providing adequate education, then you will see poverty, you will see high inequities, you will see crime, you will see things that you may not necessarily want to see in those states.
And you talk about these inequities, inequities, and inequalities. The United States, now I don't want to make a judgment about the United States, I'm not American, and I don't want to sound like I'm one of these English people being snotty, and I genuinely don't mean that, but from the outside, it does look like there's already kind of systemic inequalities within the United States. So racial inequalities is one of the things that we kind of see in the news, at least. Now, is this sort of ethnic or racial inequality widened by the provisions of the state for dyslexic kids or for special educational needs kids?
So that's a loaded question.
Yeah.
First, I want to say that I want to honor a couple different instances and events that have occurred that has caused the U.S. to be in the spotlight for the inequities that exist. So as a Black American, I identify with American culture, though my father is from the African continent. So being in America is interesting because it's just so many layers, but I'll start here so that I can keep this succinct and we can all stay on track. So when George Floyd was murdered this past summer in 2020, I think that we started to really get a glimpse of how terrible the American system of equality is. We saw that it was okay for people to share this footage. We were all traumatized, regardless if we were Black or if we were white. And we started to acknowledge that if things like this are going on in broad daylight, then imagine what is happening in boardrooms. Imagine what is happening in HR offices. Imagine what is happening in classrooms. So I think when that happened, that was the catalyst to allow us to start taking steps towards really visualizing what's happening here in America. And we were on the main global stage at that point. As you saw, different protests happening all over the world with regard to George Floyd and how he was killed in broad daylight. So I say that to say a lot of things that are happening in the classroom really correlate to someone having a knee being placed on their neck. And I just saw yesterday a teacher, a Caucasian or white American teacher, who woke up and went to her school, and for one of her lessons, she decided she wanted to dress up as a Native American woman and start hooping and hollering in the classroom and mocking the indigenous cultures. So I think that we are really seeing a lot of things that were hidden and a lot of things that were discarded or disregarded because it's time. It's all coming to light. So America definitely has some deep-rooted issues, but we can also say that, you know, our Canadian cousins have issues because we found that there were thousands of Native American bodies placed in graves and unmarked graves. So everywhere you go, there will be some issues. I'm happy that ours has come to light so that we can start addressing what is happening in the classrooms, making a pathway for children who are less fortunate with their environment or circumstances and those who are more fortunate. So communities that are usually high value, they spend money into their public schools, and their public schools are immaculate. But then you have those communities that are a little under-resourced, and the houses and properties there look very unwelcoming. So there are lots of different ways we can go with this conversation. I will say that it is a great day and time to start breaking down these inequities and start looking into the way that a country was actually developed. We need to look at how we can pivot our education system so that it will mirror one that is one that we'd be happy about, one that we'd be happy to share with other people, because right now it's not looking good.
One of the ways that inequality comes out in Britain, certainly racial inequality in Britain, is that we find that Black and other minority ethnic groups tend to be of the lower socioeconomic sort of status, if you like. They tend to have less money. In America, I'm guessing it's a similar story. I mean, I'm guessing this is kind of a universal story. Does that affect whether people are likely to be, as it were, recognized as having dyslexia? I mean, are the poor, because in general, the poor kids have slightly lower sort of academic achievement anyway. So does the socioeconomic status of groups of people affect whether they're likely to have a dyslexia diagnosis or whether they're likely to be given intervention if they do have this diagnosis?
So there are a couple different things we want to address. If you are in a low socioeconomic community, it is likely you will not have the resources to get a diagnosis. That means your school will likely not have the personnel that is qualified enough to assess you for dyslexia. That also may mean that the teachers that are at that socioeconomically low public school will not be equipped to teach you those specific, what do we say, the systematic, explicit, and sequential approaches to reading. So with that in mind, you can certainly slip through the cracks because your school does not have the resources to staff someone who can assess you properly. And not only that, but there may be little opportunities for you to get tutoring and for you to get those specific reading interventions that are needed to help you to move on to that next level of understanding.
There's an Indian educational theorist called Sugata Mitra who gave a great TED talk. And he talked about how every country has areas where teachers don't want to go because they're not great areas. But these are the areas which need the best teachers the most. And so you get this sort of, it almost compounds itself. In Britain, we know that generally lower education outcomes tend to lead to things like crime, and they tend to lead to that sort of thing. Do you get the same thing in the States?
Absolutely. We certainly get the same thing. We do get educators who would prefer to be in a more posh area, and you kind of understand their thought process. Who wants to come to work and their car is vandalized while they're teaching? Who wants to come to work and have to deal with difficult circumstances, difficult behaviors? Those things make tons of sense to me, but it's all about creating ways in which all teachers will feel welcomed and accommodated, no matter if they're in a low socioeconomic community or if they're in a higher socioeconomic community. So there's work to be done on that front. I've seen some districts that will offer certain higher pay if you come and teach at a under-resourced school, or they will try to amend your student loans if you spend a amount of time that is required at one of these schools that are under-serviced and under-resourced. So there are different loopholes that happen, different pay that can be placed as a factor, but ultimately, the community is a product of that school. If the community is run down, then it's likely that school is going to be run down as well. But I mean, it's layered. It's really layered, because you kind of want to know why that community is run down. And then it goes into so many different ways in which these communities have suffered over time and why these things have happened, and just jobs and unemployment rates and education levels of their parents. And it can go so many ways.
I mean, it's fascinating because from what you say, it sounds like educational outcomes are a product of history as much as anything else. And they're a product of a local history. And
Absolutely.
So you say that different states of America have got different laws and provisions surrounding dyslexia. This may be a slightly difficult question to ask, or maybe a really difficult question to answer. But can you tell me what different states of America, or what any part of America, how they define dyslexia? So if you're in, for instance, Michigan, what do they think dyslexia is? And is that different from if you're in, I don't know, New York or something?
So I think the definition is usually the same. However, the awareness is different and the legislation is different. Right. So how I've been taught the definition here in the state of Michigan is that dyslexia is a learning disorder that involves difficulties with reading due to problems identifying speech sounds and learning how they relate to letters and words. Dyslexia affects areas of the brain that process language. However, a dyslexic person presents normal intelligence and usually normal vision. So that's how I was taught it. And I was taught that way in graduate school. And actually, I went to graduate school in New Hampshire. So, so that was a whole nother area of the U.S. Like I said, there's 50 states, a federal district, and we have some major territories and minor territories. So provisions are different everywhere you look. But some states are doing it right. Some states need more work. Michigan, where I'm at, we are currently working to get some legislation out there that will help provide better provisions. But what happened when COVID started and everything shut down, it got placed on the back burner, which I think was a poor idea, because what we saw due to the pandemic is that more students struggled, more students suffered because they did not get those accommodations and those modifications, and they were at home and they were using a new tool to access information and to gain knowledge from teachers. So I think that definitely set us all back.
So what kind of legislation do you currently have, if any, and what kind of legislation are you trying to introduce?
Okay, so the state of Michigan, we currently have no legislation. However, we are working to make sure that our teachers are better equipped and that they themselves are able to attend schools that will provide them with Orton Gillingham training. Like, we want to embed that into the teaching programs. So if you want to become a teacher, this is what you'll have to do. This is part of that training you'll need before you can get in front of students. Also, we're looking at ways in which we can assess children before they go to first grade. So we know what the risk factors are. We know whether this child is going to need some additional support, whether this child is in the clear, or whether this child needs to get a further assessment or analysis done on them.
And what happens when a child is assessed or recognized? Is that child then taken into a special class, or does that child get an individual teacher, or is that child, as it were, assimilated into the standard classes? What sort of accommodations does the child tend to get? How does it work?
Okay, so a child at the age 5 and a half has a 92% chance of being assessed, and that assessment stating that they do have those risk factors for dyslexia. So that's a really large number. That 92% is awesome, because we know that if we can catch it at 5.5 and we can catch that, hey, there are going to be some processing issues with this particular child, then that way we can make those accommodations. Accommodations would simply look like a child getting more assistance with reading, that they're learning in a very specific way, a very systematic, sequential way, and that we are teaching them explicitly. That could look like that child getting pulled out of class for 15 to 30 minutes to have that one-on-one instruction. Yeah. That could look like that child being able to get a tutor after school to help work on those specific speech sounds or those specific letter sounds. We could also look at potentially providing that child with assistance with other comorbidities like dysgraphia or dyscalculia. So it could look like a lot of different things, but what is important is that you acknowledge that there could potentially be a processing issue. There could potentially be a issue with how this child learns to read. So that identification piece is important, because we can use those evidence-based practices to help that child as they are gaining more momentum, reaching that benchmark or that milestone.
Yeah. And does this reflect your experiences in different areas of America?
Yeah, so when I lived in Mississippi, there was an assessment, there probably still is, when the child was at first grade, there was an assessment process that took place so that could help guide the child's matriculation moving forward. Here in the state of Michigan, currently there is a third grade reading law. And that law states that if the child is not able to read on a third grade level by third grade, then that child will get placed back in that third grade class. So for me, that particular law is kind of counterproductive. We want to catch it before, and I say it is the difficulties. We want to catch those difficulties before third grade, and we don't want to use holding that child back as a means of like reprimanding them. Yeah. We have seen statistically that if the child cannot read at a third grade level by third grade, then they are going to struggle throughout the majority of their matriculation moving forward. Third grade is that sweet spot, but I think it's important that we address it before it gets to the point where we have to say, well, we're going to have to keep you behind a year. You know, it should be addressed before that.
Yeah, I mean, I was kept behind a year twice, and it doesn't feel good.
Yeah, and that's another key component of that self-esteem we were talking about.
Yeah. So if a child is given, say, a formal diagnostic assessment in, I don't know, in Mississippi, and then the parents move to Seattle, is that diagnostic assessment recognized across borders?
There are no, there's some screeners that exist. And I'm thinking reflectively because, as I stated, everybody does things differently. Every state does things differently. I have not seen one across the board that is being used. When I think of an assessment process, I think about all of the different layers of that assessment. Like, first and foremost, you want to get a family history. You want to know about mom and dad. You want to know about mom's pregnancy. You want to know whether mom and dad or their other children have had issues with reading or with writing or with the language. Those kind of come into play. Then you want to do some additional assessments. Some people think it's debatable to do an intelligence test and to add that to that portfolio of assessments you're doing. So it looks different everywhere, and it's unfortunate because I do think there should be one way to assess instead of multiple ways to assess. But then again, you want to get other professionals involved too. So there is a assessment that a lot of speech and language pathologists perform called the TEALS assessment, and the TEALS assessment assesses literacy and language skills. But some people may think that it's important to have other paraprofessionals or health professionals involved in assessment. You know, I've seen people say that psychologists can do the dyslexia assessment, and some say that speech language pathologist or the classroom teacher, or so it's kind of a jumbled up mess as you hear me kind of ramble on. But that's kind of where we are, unfortunately.
Yeah, because it's interesting. It seems that if different assessments are testing differently, like some are testing for intelligence and some are saying, okay, a psychologist should do it, and some are saying a speech language pathologist should do it, you're going to get different results, aren't you?
I agree. There could be some definite variance between your testing results. Now, I actually have a screener that I've created. And the screener that I've created is evidence-based and research-backed. And basically, it's just a means of understanding whether you meet those characteristics of a dyslexic learner. And if so, then that prompts that professional to say, okay, we need to do a full-out assessment. Or they can look at it, and if you don't meet the markers or the specific number of markers on that checklist, then at that point they can say, I think you're within normal limits of learning and processing language. So I think that's a great start. Because you want to see if there needs to be an investment of time and energy placed on this assessment process, because it could be long and it could involve multiple professionals.
And of course, as you say, if it takes time and it takes money, then the poorer districts are less likely to have that money. Or does it work like that, or is
Yes.
the money given by the state government, the federal government?
So usually, that's loaded, because when you're looking at assessing a child, I've never, in my time working in education, I've never seen a IEP, which is an individual education plan, that said dyslexia. So it's always specific learning disorder. And with that, then the school does pay for an assessment. However, if the school does not have the appropriate professionals in place, then there is going to be a wait, because they're going to have to utilize professionals for the district. And as you can imagine, if a district has 50 schools, you're definitely going to be placed on some type of waiting list. you're definitely going to be placed at the back of the line for this particular assessment. So if you are a fan of instant gratification and knowing immediately this is not the route you want to take with a school in a low resourced area. Now, if you're in a school that is affluent and has an abundance of resources, then the timeline will look a lot different for that child and for that family.